This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, Governor Rick Scott begins his second term, and some are wondering where he plans to take the state. A federal judge lifts the ban on gay marriages in Florida. Two Central Florida Republican Congress members lead the effort to unseat House Speaker John Boehner. And a federal judge says that Florida is violating the law by keeping Medicaid reimbursement rates low. Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorai.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Adam Goodman is a political consultant and a Republican. Dr. Darrell Paulson is a professor emeritus of government from USF St. Petersburg. William March is a political writer, and Barry Edwards is a political strategist and a Democrat. Well, thank you guys for coming. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Well, Governor Rick Scott was inaugurated into his second term this week.
Making history as only the second Republican governor to win re-election.
So help me God. So help me God. Congratulations, Governor.
The governor touted his job creation record and vowed to continue to work to create private sector jobs.
When we set this goal in 2010, Florida's economy was losing jobs, housing prices were dropping. Many predicted it'd take way more than 7 years to get out of the downward spiral of job loss and increased debt. But we proved them wrong. In less than 4 years, the businesses and the hard-working people of Florida clearly generated way more than 700,000 jobs.
Under the governor's first term, unemployment dropped from more than 11% to 5.8%.
We are focused on growing jobs in Florida. We must realize that positions our state as a fighter in a great movement against the silent growth of government. Many states like Florida are fighting to limit the growth of government and grow opportunity instead.
At the same time, Florida's state budget has grown from just under $70 billion to more than $77 billion. The governor and the legislature have pushed for dismantling the state's growth planning agency and scaled back environmental protection rules.
I realize that all candidates for public office talk about how important the environment is to the health of our people and our state. But talk is cheap. We have to make the investments necessary to turn talk into reality. We have made great environmental strides, and we will continue to do so.
The governor began his first term 4 years ago aligned with the Tea Party, and now many are wondering if he still holds those Tea Party beliefs.
So, Darrell, let's start with that question. Is this the same governor, same ideology that the governor had 4 years ago?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, clearly the jobs message is still there, and it's going to be there because that's the thing that brought him to office in the first place. So you're going to continue to focus in on the one issue that's your real strength. But it is different in many respects. I mean, the Tampa Bay Times even talked about a softer tone in his inaugural address and a softer tone in terms of talking about what he's going to do in his second term. The big issue here is what is he going to do with his second term and what is going to be his legacy at the end of his 8 years in office. You've only had two Republican governors, Jeb Bush and now Governor Scott, who have been elected 2 consecutive terms to office. Certainly Governor Bush left a legacy, and the 3 Democratic governors who have served 2 terms, Askew and Graham and Childs, all left their own legacy, whether it was ethics or the environment or government reform kinds of issues. But the question is still unanswered with respect to Scott in terms of what his legacy is going to be. Is it simply going to be the jobs issue? And related to jobs, is it going to be the fact that he's stolen jobs from Texas and Illinois and California rather than creating jobs internally here in Florida?
Well, that was a theme in his speech. He called out to New York State and Illinois and California, Barry, and he said, look, we want you people to move here. Not only does he want companies to move here from those states, he wants people to move here from those states.
Well, and I was disappointed. I was expecting big ideas a la Jeb Bush or Reuben Askew or Bob Graham, and I didn't get any. He's for cutting taxes. Well, everybody's always for cutting taxes, but he's not for a broad-based tax that helps me and the middle-class families of Florida. He wants to hunt and peck and give his cronies little tax decreases. But last week, the Florida Education Magazine came out and ranked Florida the 28th or best in education. So there's 27 states better than us in education. Our per pupil spending is $2,300 lower than those other states. Well, where is his focus on education? He wants jobs. I don't want minimum wage jobs in Florida. I want jobs that require skills and people that have the skills to do them. And so I'm a little disappointed that he hasn't got that. And all this growth that he wants to get these people from Florida, how's he going to pay for it? We had unbridled growth, and it took Florida years to catch up. I think we need more details.
So, Adam, it is quite an accomplishment, though, to go from 11% unemployment to, just over 5.5%. That's not too shabby.
The number one issue in this state and in America are jobs. It's the number one issue. It was the number one issue 2 years ago. It was the number one issue 4 years ago. It's the number one issue today. So if the governor does nothing more than to continue to create and draw and attract jobs, he's done a heck of a job, and he's right where people want him to be.
Mm-hmm. Wendy, one of the big, I think, disputes in the governor's record is that did he promise to create 700,000 jobs, or did he promise to create 1.7 million jobs?
Well, the only figure that Rick Scott ever used was 700,000 jobs. But then reporters asked him, is that just 700,000 jobs over where we are right now? Or is that 700,000 jobs in addition to those that would be naturally expected if there was no change in policy? He repeatedly said 700,000, and he said it looking into a number of different video cameras, 700,000 in addition to what's expected by natural growth.
So did he keep that promise?
No, not yet, but he's got 3 more years. He said 700,000 jobs in 7 years. At the time, about 1 million jobs were expected to be created over those 7 years, but Scott now denies that that is what he actually promised, even though it's on videotape in many places. His response is that, well, nobody really knows how many jobs would have been created naturally.
That doesn't make any difference to me, though, I think, because the public's going to look at it in terms of we're better off than we were 4 years ago, and that's the big question for them. I mean, whether it's new jobs or whatever, everyone recognizes when you look at the unemployment rate today as opposed to what it was 4 years ago, Florida's in a much better circumstance, and he's going to benefit from that. I think he is shifting his focus a little bit away from jobs. I mean, education is becoming more of a priority of his, and some people would say, well, strange from somebody who cut the education budget substantially during his first term in office, but he's talking about a substantial, the largest increase in education funding. So I think he's trying to move out there, whether this is part of that projection of a softer image. I think it's also interesting to look at who was at the inaugural. I mean, you had Governor Perry of Texas, you had Governor Christie of New Jersey there. Christie, of course, as the head of the Republican Governors Association, had given the Scott campaign $18 million as part of his campaign fund. So there is a really good, strong relationship between those two individuals, but who was not there was Jeb Bush.
I think you really have to say that Rick Scott has fully made the transition from the Tea Party champion he was when he took office to an establishment Republican.
And that generally happens over time.
Yeah.
It generally happens when leaders become leaders over time. They aren't born, they're kind of evolved.
What do you make about Daryl's point that Jeb Bush wasn't there? Should we draw anything from that?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing, okay. Barry, what would you say? Jeb Bush wasn't at the inauguration.
Jeb Bush was in New Jersey raising money for his presidential campaign. So he endorsed Governor Scott. He did a video for Governor Scott. I think that there's no question that he supported Governor Scott, and it may have made the difference. So it's unfortunate that he didn't support, because otherwise we'd be talking about Governor Christ.
All right. Well, this week, Florida became the 36th state in the nation to allow same-sex marriages.
I didn't think I'd ever see it, and the kids were all happy.
My wish came true. Because they love each other.
What's love?
Love is like people want to be together forever.
And around the state, on the first day, there was a rush to get married.
They surprised me. I didn't know they were coming.
So when we found out around 11:10 that it was definitely a go, I ran out and got balloons. We started making signs. We started gathering, and we're all just really excited and happy for him.
I now pronounce you joined in matrimony.
But opponents of same-sex marriage say, not so fast. They're promising to challenge the legality of the marriages all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Attorney General Pam Bondi, who had fought hard to keep Florida's gay marriage ban in place, this week had little to say.
So, Barry, I talked with one of the attorneys that works for the Liberty Counsel this week. They say they're mad at this decision. It ignores the will of Florida voters from 2008, and they're going to fight it all the way to the Supreme Court.
Let's put this in perspective. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter in our system for what the law is and what the Constitution is, and they were the ones, the federal courts, enforced civil rights for 20 years until it became part of the American fabric. And the federal courts are doing the same thing. They have to interpret the Constitution. And my friends that are scholars in law school all think that the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause is a slam dunk. So I don't understand why the Republicans have got away from the libertarian streak that they had in the 60s with Barry Goldwater, that wanted government out of our bedrooms, out of our boardrooms, and have gotten embroiled in this. Pam Bondi is a friend of mine. I think that she's going to have to spend the rest of her life, like Robert Byrd had to spend the rest of his life making up for being a segregationist. I think she's going to have to spend the rest of her career making up for the marriage equality. I think she's gone too far, and I think that that's going to be what her legacy is. But I think that the courts always do this. David Jolly had a great answer. He said he was the son of a minister, and he says, I'm personally for a man and a woman, but the Constitution, when I read it, says equal protection, and so he's for marriage equality. I think it's a slam dunk.
Let's go to a friend of Pam Bondi's. Adam, what would you say back?
Well, first of all, I think the allusion to a segregationist from the past is outrageous. Pam was really there to have to do her job, and whether she liked it or not in terms of this particular issue, she did her job. And what she wanted from the beginning, and she wants even now, is finality. She wants a final answer so people can get on with their lives and know what to expect. The court system, unfortunately, is not something that's built for speed. And because it isn't, sometimes it takes time to get to that answer. Right now, the Sixth Circuit has made their decision. It looks like they finally provide the U.S. Supreme Court with a reason now to weigh in and give that final decision from the highest court in the land. But in terms of Florida, I think I'm pleased that even though voters not so long ago, by 61%, put this into the Constitution, that we pursued this the way we should have from the beginning, led by Pam Bondi and others, which is to get to the courts to weigh in and give us the answer.
Well, Pam Bondi's in a difficult position because the law of the state of Florida, the Constitution, says she has to enforce the laws, and the law of Florida was opposed to same-sex marriage, so she was enforcing the law enacted by the voters of Florida. On the other hand, the courts have long said that voters don't have the right to take away individuals' constitutional rights. There are a number of famous cases in California where they had an open housing initiative where people could sell their house or not sell their house to whomever they wanted to. And the United States Supreme Court said you don't have the right to take away the constitutional right of people, even if a majority of the voters decide to do so. And that's a similar situation to what's happened here in Florida. Even though a majority of the voters decided against same-sex marriage, the court is saying you don't have the right to constitutionally remove their constitutionally protected rights.
On the question of the Attorney General, whether or not she was right to keep pursuing this, I've heard some people say, well, if she really believes in enforcing the parts of the Florida Constitution, she did nothing about redistricting when the legislature drew districts that favored one party over the other. So she didn't go in and kind of embrace the lawsuits that were filed to change redistricting.
Yeah, and then there where you get mixed up into another political issue, and that's the political question as to who has control over this, the courts or the legislature. I mean, the courts have given great restraint to the legislative bodies to do their own gerrymandering or drawing of legislative districts. And once again, the courts have never ruled against gerrymandering except in the case of racial gerrymandering.
Redistricting is one thing, Rob, but you could also have brought up the fact that the Florida Constitution says polluters are required to pay the cost of cleanup of their pollution. That's not happening in the Everglades. There's something in the Constitution that the Attorney General isn't challenging. I think there's no question that Bondi had discretion on this as to how hard to push this. Bill McCollum, for example, her predecessor, as Attorney General, declined to appeal a ruling throwing out Florida's law that outlawed adoption by same-sex couples. He, in his discretion as Attorney General, decided not to pursue that.
I think Pam Bondi could get right with history and right with a lot of the people that have supported the LGBT and the marriage equality by offering to officiate a mass marriage ceremony like Clerk of the Court in Hillsborough, Pat Frank, did. I think that would go a long way to assuaging a lot of the hurt feelings.
Adam, any last words on Pam Bondi?
I think she did a very difficult task, and she did it with her head held high and with an idea of trying to do the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing is not agreed by everyone involved. But it was a tough job, and I think she did it with honor.
Okay. Well, 2 Republican lawmakers from Central Florida saw their power diminished this week for leading an effort to topple John Boehner as Speaker of the House.
Congressman Daniel Webster of Orlando and Richard Nugent of Spring Hill are no longer on the powerful House Rules Committee panel after voting against Boehner when he ran again for Speaker. Boehner won, but a surprising 25 of his fellow House members voted against him.
Adam, was this based on ideology? I mean, talk about, why these 2 Congress members would take a chance. It looks to me like they took a chance. Was it based on ideology? What was the reasoning there?
I think there has been a restlessness in Washington to try to find the right formula to get things to work, not just as a body, in its entirety, but within the 2 parties. And I think this challenge, you want to call it a challenge, was just simply a part of democracy as it's played out in the chamber. I think it's a good thing to have leadership elections. I don't think leadership by decree or fiat is a healthy thing for the system. And in this case, 2 Floridians are very much, well, 3 actually, but 2 in particular, are very much in the middle of this, Dan Webster and Rich Nugent. Dan Webster is one of the most principled people I have ever met in this business, was the longest serving legislator in the history, I think, of Florida, former House Speaker, former Senate Majority Leader. He came to this very late in the game, and it's not like he was trying to seek a headline. He went there to Washington for one reason. He wanted to fix it. And a lot of people feel that same frustration. But after it was said and done, he shook John Boehner's hands and said, I'm with you. Let's go.
All right.
And then Boehner said, I'm taking away the Rules Committee from you. So there is political payback in these kinds of situations. But Webster said this was not about ideology, it was about process, that he had some major issues that he and other Republicans wanted heard. Boehner wouldn't allow that under the rules that he controlled, and so it was as much about process as it was ideology.
And I agree with Adam. I think if you know Dan Webster, whether you agree with him politically or not, he's always honorable, totally ethical. There's never been a question of his motivations. But what I think this reflects is that Florida, for being the 3rd largest state now, the 4th largest delegation, really has a relatively weak delegation. We have 1 chairman. Now we have some hopes. We have a couple of our younger congressmen, Vern Buchanan is on Ways and Means, and David Jolly is on Appropriations. So hopefully in 10, 20 years we'll have some more clout, but we're not getting our fair share of appropriations back to Florida.
Well, Wendy, that's a good question. Why don't we? I mean, we have a large Republican delegation. The Republicans control now the House and the Senate. Why don't we have more clout in D.C.?
Well, partly because of the number of new, comparatively new lawmakers that we've sent up there. Some of the Republicans from this area, for example, David Jolly, a freshman, or I guess he's a sophomore now, if you count it 1 year. Ted Yoho, who was part of the rebellion. Nugent himself is about his 3rd term, but no one to compare to someone like Bill Young, who had been the longest tenured member. Now, as Barry just said, we've got 29 congressmen, members of Congress from Florida, and 1 committee chairman. Texas, by comparison, has 6. California probably will have about 5, even though it's more heavily stacked Democratic, who are now in the minority. And a number of Florida congressmen aren't happy about the comparative lack of representation here.
Okay. Well, a federal judge in Miami has ruled that Florida's health care system for impoverished and disabled children violates several U.S. laws.
In a ruling this week, the judge said lawmakers have been setting the state's Medicaid budget at an artificially low level for years, causing pediatricians and other specialists for children to opt out of the insurance program for the needy. The judge called that rationing of care and said it exacerbated a shortage of pediatricians, particularly in rural areas. The Agency for Healthcare Administration, though, said the judge's observations were outdated and pertained to a Medicaid program that no longer exists. The agency also called the program a success. But Tampa Congresswoman Kathy Castor blasted the state's handling of the children's health care program and called for the federal government to step in to oversee it.
So we've got 2 views on this. We've got the state saying, look, it's a success, and the federal judge is looking backwards, not to what's going on now. But Kathy Castor says we need federal oversight. Wendy?
Well, both sides are right to at least a certain extent. The state says that the program that the judge criticized no longer exists. What in fact has happened is they've enacted a reform that transforms all of Florida's Medicaid program into a managed care system as opposed to the previous fee-for-service system. What that doesn't prove, however, is whether it will be able to provide that health care that thousands and thousands of these kids are not getting under the old system. That has not yet been determined, and Florida has not. What Florida has not done is increase its level of spending on the Medicaid program, which historically has been very low, flirting with 50th in the nation.
Does the federal government have any juice or any power to tell the state legislature you've got to spend more money on Medicaid?
Well, the judge could. In the 1990s, a judge fined the state $10,000 a day over funding for services to the disabled. Now, this judge has not yet decided on what remedy or punishment he's going to try to impose. Those fines were never collected, but they did spur the Florida legislature to increase funding for services for the disabled. Who knows whether something like this is going to happen here. Right now, this is completely up in the air as to what's going to happen as a result of this decision. The judge has ruled that Florida is violating the Constitution by not adequately funding Medicaid for children, but he has not said what's to be done about it.
Barry, you know, there's a lot of talk about rationing of care. A lot of people said Obamacare is going to result in rationing of care, but here's an actual example where a judge has found that there is rationing of care, but this is for low-income kids.
Right, and we always talk about how much we care about children, but it's all just talk. Here's an example where one thing, the legislature could pass the Medicaid expansion, get $5 billion in from the federal government, and could take care of a lot of these things with the $5 billion that's sitting up there, which would be a huge infrastructure, which would give Rick Scott all the jobs that he's promised. So there's easier solutions. Take the $5 billion and quit rationing care and really do take care of our children.
One of the political realities is that children don't vote, and so oftentimes in politics the children are neglected and left out of things because they don't vote, they don't have any political clout. I've seen it happen so many times. I worked for the Guardian Ad Litem program for a long time, and they're sort of the afterthought. If there's any money left over, it's a good financial year, we'll give it to the kids, but other than that, I mean, they have to pull and claw and beg in order to get fair treatment.
Medicaid has been the biggest challenge financially, fiscally, for almost every state in the country. And I agree with Barry and others. I think we have to get it right. I happen to be one of the Republicans that believes we should probably done something in taking the offer that was given us of the billions of dollars and the jobs that would go with it. And one reason I believe that is because the biggest health providers, and in some ways the most important health providers in this state, the hospitals, were solidly behind this because without it, they could suffer severe financial turmoil, some of them, and that's not good for anyone's health.
Do you think there's going to be any movement on Medicaid expansion this year in the legislature?
I think there will be. Yeah. I think there will be, but it's going to be conducted, I think, on somewhat different terms than it was before.
Okay. Well, before we go, what other news stories should we be paying attention to? Darrell, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's been a good month for Jeb Bush. I mean, he's announced that he's thinking about running for the presidency. He's formed these exploratory committees, set up separate fundraising vehicles for him. Larry Sabato, who looks at presidential elections very closely, never had any of the 20 or so Republicans who are mentioned as possible candidates in the top tier because he didn't think they qualified until this past couple of weeks, and he's now stuck Jeb Bush in the top tier of Republican candidates. So he's got a long way to go. It's very early in the process, but I think it's been a very good month. I think he's frozen out, to many respects, some of the other Republicans, and I think he's forced them probably to make some decisions, and now he's come out with his plan to raise $100 million in the first 3 months of this year, and that's really going to freeze out some of the other Republican candidates in the field.
And does that mean freezing out also Marco Rubio?
Marco's already been frozen a little bit. A further freeze is in order, I think, probably, yes.
All right, Barry, your other big story.
I think the story that next Friday at noon, qualifying ends for the City Council and Mayor of Tampa. And Bob Buckhorn looks like he's marching toward an unopposed bid, and he just launched. Now, Adam will probably disagree with this. I think a great commercial. Tampa's got his swagger back. He's bragging about the convention, the airport flights, the job creation, his neighborhood leaders. Tampa does have its swagger back, and it shows you that leaders matter.
But why is he running a commercial if nobody's opposing?
That's why, because nobody wants to get in and hit. He's got $400,000, I think, in the bank. So anybody that gets in now is starting from zero. And the only person who ever did that successfully was Pam Iorio, and there doesn't seem to be a Pam Iorio stalking out there that could take him.
Isn't democracy wonderful to have all of these choices we'll have in the city?
What are your other big story?
Well, it was going to be Medicaid expansion. Now, Adam just said he thinks the legislature is going to act on that this year, but there have been a lot of signs, including a recent story about a day or so ago by John Kennedy in the Orlando Sentinel, saying that it looks like it will go down again. And this is, the Republicans who oppose it say that the federal government can't be relied on to keep the promise under the Medicaid program, but the result is a particularly cruel joke for about 670,000 people who are between 100% and 138% of the federal poverty level. They're just above the poverty line. They don't qualify for the subsidies that you get when you buy health insurance under Obamacare because they're supposed to be covered by the expanded Medicaid. But because the Medicaid has not been expanded, they get nothing. So,
and we're talking about the working poor. They're not poverty. They're not in poverty.
No,
they're
if they were poor enough, they'd be served by Medicaid as it stands.
Right.
But they're not poor enough for that. But they don't make enough money to qualify for the federal help that's available under Obamacare.
They have no lobbyists in Tallahassee.
There is a bitter irony there.
Yeah. Adam, you're the big story.
I'm going to tee off from where Daryl was. Jeb has had an amazing start. I like the fact he's already, shooting out there videos from his cell phone. I love that. He's very Jeb. What's going to happen next, though, is in the Rubio decision could create the kind of domino effect that happened when Charlie Crist decided not to run for re-election as governor and went for the U.S. Senate. Because if Marco decides not to run in 2016 and pursues the presidential campaign, which he said if he does run for president, he will not run for Senate as well at the same time, which he could legally for some period of time. Then all sorts of things come into play, all sorts of players come into play for their time in the sun, in the political sun, beginning not long from now.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody, for a great show. And thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. You can write us at ftw@wedu.org or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And you can watch this show online on the wedu.org website beginning Monday morning. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a great weekend.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.